Woo! It's nice to be outside. Yeah? Not that we don't love our sanctuary. We absolutely do. Sure, it gets a little warm in the summer, but we're working on that. See the table over there for more. But it's nice to step outside every once in a while to get a new perspective, to see things from a different point of view. After all, we tend to be creatures of habit. We like things the way we like them, and we don't like things to change too much. A little change, fine. Mostly. Depending on how little. Actually, what kind of change are we talking about here? The point is, it's nice to step outside every once in a while to gain a new perspective, to leave our favorite pew and step out into the world, to pause for just a second to share with those who have gathered why it is we gather at all. Friends, this service, like this week, is a chance for us as a people of faith to share with all of those we encounter the gift that we have found here. And if we've learned nothing else from the gospel, it is that life is lived in the sharing. And so today, on this day when we leave the comfort of our sanctuary to step out into the world, on this week when we will prepare to welcome children and neighbor onto our front lawn, on this day when we welcome new faces to our fellowship, we pause for just a moment to be reminded what it means to share. Today we hear a story about 12 disciples, 5 loaves, 2 fish, 1 Messiah, 5,000 men, and an untold number of women and children. That's right, today we hear a story that is so popular, so well known, that it has its own moniker. It is known simply as the feeding of the 5,000. It's one of the only stories told in all 4 of the Gospels. And each of the Gospels, writing to a different audience at a different time, has a different take on the story. Mark, for instance, thinks it's really important to tell us that they broke into groups of 50. Luke, ever practical, tells us exactly how much it would cost to feed 5,000 men and an untold number of women and children. John, always different, has a little child offering up the loaves and the fish. And all of those takes are meaningful. But today we hear from Matthew, who not only offers us the shortest account, you're welcome, but also takes a totally different take on it, frames it in a totally different way than any of the other Gospels. You see, for Matthew, the feeding of the 5,000 doesn't just pop up out of nowhere, but is instead a response to a hard moment in the life of Jesus, the death of John the Baptist. The breaking of the bread here, as happens at the end of his gospel, is a way to deal with loss. Now, it's been a little while since Advent, so you'll be forgiven if you've forgotten about John the Baptist, but he still in the gospel is doing his thing. You may remember him as the one crying out in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord." You might remember him as the one who wore camel's hair, ate locusts, disgusting. You might remember him as the one who Jesus called friend. And so this story begins with the loss of a friend. This happy story in which so many in need are offered the bread of life begins with the bread of life himself in need. Now, we're more likely to want to just jump to the good parts of the story, the food. It's like when we come to church and just want to get to the gathering center afterwards. we know what it's like, or perhaps the ice cream today, or other things that might be coming your way. I get it, we'll get there. But first, we have to go through the parts of the human condition that make us human, and loss, as we know, friends, is one of them. Who among us hasn't experienced loss? If not of a friend, then certainly of a relationship, or a sense of security, or a job, or health, or hope. Maybe some of us are experiencing a form of loss this morning. If so, perhaps we've come to the right place. That's part of what it means to be the church, to share in one another's suffering. There's some good things too, and we'll get there, but this is a moment when we might learn what Jesus had to say and do in the midst of loss. So Jesus, the story begins, he hears the news, and immediately he goes in a boat to a deserted place by himself. He hears the news and he goes to be away by himself. He finds time to be on his own. Sometimes we resist that in our own lives. We think we just have to stick to it, to muscle through, to find our way. We don't want to look weak. We want to make our way through. We know what this is like. Some of us have experienced that even this year. We know what it's like to face things that are overwhelming and to not know how to find our way through. Here we have an example of Jesus himself when faced with that kind of loss, stepping away. Friends, this is Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, the big J, Jesus himself. When he's confronted with something that is overwhelming, he needs to take time to be by himself. What makes us think we're better? What makes us think that we don't need a chance to step away to process? And not all of us need to be out in a boat in the wilderness. Sometimes our wilderness is something else, but we all need it. Superman had his fortress of solitude. Maybe ours looks a little differently. Maybe ours is a physical place, but maybe it's an emotional state. Maybe it's a frame of reference. Maybe it's a different place that we can go to process. Maybe the church is one of those places for you. It's almost poetic that in this gospel, Jesus goes to cry out in the wilderness for the one who spent his life crying out in the wilderness. And maybe some of us need to shed a few tears ourselves. But this story also gives us hope in the sense that he doesn't stay there forever. It's going to take each of us a different amount of time to deal with loss and struggle in our lives, but there comes a moment when we have to realize that is not the end of our story. It might not even be the climax. Jesus finds a way back into life. And when he comes back in, just like when we return from vacation and we check our inbox and we are flooded with things and we know all of those problems we left behind are still there when we got back, Jesus steps to the shore and everybody wants his attention. Everybody is there, only he's taken time so now that he can face that attention. And he spends the entire day curing, healing, talking to people who are in pain. Even though he's in pain himself, he spends his day working with them. And he spends the whole day that is so much so that his disciples start to get a little freaked out. They're looking at the clock. Not really. They're looking at the sun going down. They're paying attention to what time of day it is, feeling that rumble in their belly. Maybe some of us are feeling that now. They're getting to that space where they're thinking, when is the meal coming? And trying to say to Jesus surreptitiously, don't we need to close things down, maybe move on? They'd gotten into their routine, that familiar pattern. They'd spend their days out working with the people, and they'd go back and sit on their own to be with Jesus on their own and share a meal. They didn't want to share it with everybody else. But Jesus looks out at the people, and he looks at his disciples, and he says, they need not go away. You feed them. You feed them. In the Greek, the you is really emphasized, as if to say, like, I'm not talking about someone else, it's you, like you, not like you. You go and feed them. This is different because the disciples up until this point in Jesus' ministry have just been the followers. They're the ones who walked alongside. They sort of clap their hands and do the rah-rah thing when they see Jesus doing things out in the world. But now he's looking at them and saying, no, you go and do this. You try and take something on. It means a change, and as we know, change is hard. So they do what all of us do when we see change or feel the need for change. We offer practical reasons why it cannot happen that way. And they look around, we can imagine, at that group of 5,000 men and an untold number of women and children, and they look back at Jesus and they come up with the best argument why they couldn't do it. We only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. We have 5 loaves and 2 fish, and there are 5,000 men and an untold number of women and children. What are we going to do to feed them? And Jesus says, why don't you bring them to me? And so he takes the loaves, and just like at the end of his ministry, he blesses them. Then he hands them back to the disciples, and he says, go and share. And they do, though we'd imagine there would be some other arguments. We might imagine that more conservative disciple looking Jesus in the eye, having a sit-down talk with him to say, you know, Jesus, we can't just be giving people fish. Shouldn't we be teaching them to fish, right? Here we are giving them fish, and Jesus just looking at him and making it clear, no, I mean give them a fish. Sometimes we just need to give people a fish. And as the story goes, all ate and were filled. And even more miraculously, perhaps, there are 12 baskets full of the leftovers at the end. Now, we have a lot of questions as we hear this story, like how big were those loaves? 5,000 men and an untold number of women and children? Those are big pieces of bread. But there's a great mystery in this story for us, but we have spent Christian history thinking about the math of it. We've focused so much, we've called this the multiplication of the loaves and fish, though the story doesn't say that's what happened. To be fair, it doesn't preclude it either. It just says that all ate and were filled, and that there was some left over, enough to fill 12 baskets. But maybe some of us need that version of the story today. Maybe some of us have been thinking to ourselves, well, I have gifts, but they're a little measly. Maybe they're not quite enough. Maybe I don't have enough to really make a difference in this world. Perhaps that lesson for us then should be to never underestimate what God can do with a little gift. That no gift we have is too small. So maybe if you've been thinking, I have something to offer, but it may not be enough, why not share it? But that, of course, is not the only way to look at this story. There is the other possibility, or at least one of many other possibilities. It could be that when those disciples gave up their dinner, those 5 loaves and those 2 fish, that they took them out, and as they shared them with the people around them, others thought, well, if they're willing to share what they have, I guess I could share some of what I have. And suddenly, perhaps miraculously, there was enough. And in this world in which we are so reticent to try our hand at sharing, to give up that which we perceive as ours, maybe it helps to be reminded that sometimes the act of sharing itself inspires others to do the same. Think about the way that our outreach ministries here started at Asbury First. We began with a few bags of clothing. We began with a few peanut butter sandwiches. We began with a few physicals. And others were inspired to share. What is the miracle of this story? Is it that the bread filled all? Is it that there was enough to go around? Is it that there was some left over at the end? No, maybe the miracle for our modern ears in this story is that someone tried something to begin with. So often we stand here and we look at the world, we get another alert on our phone, and we think there's nothing we can do. The world is hopeless, it's too big of a problem. What could I do? I might as well not do anything. But this story promises something different, that it's worth a try. That the only way we're going to change this world is if we're willing to step outside of our comfort zones. If we're willing to share what we have, not just our money, though that helps, but the more precious resource that we've been given, time. This is one of those weeks when we recognize that precious gift of time, with so many volunteers who have made the summer sale happen, and tent week happen, and vacation Bible school happen, and the parking happen, and Park Ave Fest happen, and all of the things that are going on right now. It is a precious gift of time. It is finite, and what a gift it is to share it with someone else. Friends, it means stepping outside every once in a while, leaving the sanctuary not just on Tent Sunday, but every Sunday, ready to share the gift of God that we have found in this fellowship together. It means going out and re-envisioning how we use our buildings and rethinking what it is that we want to do to live out our mission. It means change, even when it's hard. Make no mistake, we live in a hungry world. But we have the bread of life. And we don't know, and we'll never know if it's enough to go around unless we're willing to share. Friends, the promise of the gospel is that life is lived in the sharing. May it be so. Amen.